In a matter of 3 weeks, the Russian aviation industry slid back 3 decades. With one rambling justification and a subsequent brazen invasion came a cascading series of implications that brought the golden era of global aviation cooperation to a screeching halt. As a 21st century Iron Curtain fell across Eastern Europe, Russian commercial aviation began reverting to a bygone era. An era marked by tension, by distrust bordering on paranoia, and by extreme and utter isolation. International trips hinged on their ability to prove the travel was absolutely necessary and the ability to pass extensive background checks. For the average Moscow resident with a hint of wanderlust, well, there was Sochi, or Odessa, or Dombay. Of course, strict rules over what went out also informed what went in. Inbound international flights, when allowed, were bound to specific, sometimes suspiciously circuitous routings. Incoming visitors were given strict travel itineraries, and closed airspace was closely monitored. One that current events have us poised to return to. Just hours after Russian missiles began tearing across Ukrainian skies, it became apparent that it wouldn't only be Ukrainian airspace taking on a new atmosphere of hostility. The same day the invasion began, the UK Department for Transport banned all civilian Russian aircraft from its airspace. Direct Aeroflot flights from Moscow to Heathrow would be no more. In the following days, the European Union, Canada, then the United States, among others, banned Russian flights from their airspace. Russia, for its part, responded in kind, closing its airspace to the 30-plus unfriendly countries in a tit-for-tat move. Walls went up, and an era of unprecedented peacetime mobility slammed shut. Aeroflot, which just days before had operated international flights as far east as Tokyo and as far west as Los Angeles, announced on March 5th that its only international service would be into the capital city of Minsk in Allied Belarus. European and American carriers began diverting routes so as to avoid Russian airspace. Russian airspace that U.S. airlines typically crossed an average of 1,400 times a week. Flights like Lufthansa's LH716 from Frankfurt to Tokyo once arched over Siberia, but now cut south through Central Asia. One last flown in the late 80s, adding more than 3 hours of flight time, but avoiding Russia entirely. As to the long-term impact of Russia's invasion on Russian aviation. Beyond the growing divide between Russian and global skies, the country's aviation industry is also experiencing a new digital divide. You see, whether it be a hotel in Zanzibar, a rental car company in Jeju, or a regional airline in Guatemala, the entire world of travel is all connected by the Global Distribution System, the GDS. At the simplest level, the GDS is a common, connected way to communicate and book inventory between travel providers. When a passenger flies Delta from Seattle to Amsterdam, then connects on KLM to Athens, Delta and KLM's systems need to communicate. If they didn't, the passenger wouldn't be able to get their KLM boarding pass when checking in Seattle, they wouldn't be able to check their bag all the way through to Athens, they wouldn't be able to get help from KLM if a Delta delay led to a misconnection. Back-end communication is crucial for the cohesive travel experience from airline to airline. Now, GDS software is essentially run by 3 companies: Amadeus, Sabre, and Travelport. Combined, they hold the market outright. This decision was guided by the fact that Aeroflot is a majority state-owned airline, and so Aeroflot revenue would go directly to the very entity funding the deadly invasion of Ukraine. Now, without access to the GDS, Aeroflot flights no longer appear on Google Flights, Expedia, Skyscanner, or any other online travel agency. To book, one must go directly to Aeroflot's website. In addition, and perhaps more crucially, Aeroflot flights can no longer be booked as part of itineraries with other airlines. While most international airlines have suspended service to Russia, Middle Eastern carriers, namely Turkish, Qatar, Etihad, and Emirates, have emerged as a crucial air bridge for the country. One of the few convenient ways in or out, especially when heading to Western destinations. Etihad, in particular, used to code-share with Aeroflot, allowing a passenger to book a ticket from Abu Dhabi to Moscow, then seamlessly connect onwards on Aeroflot to Sochi, for example. Without GDS, this is no longer possible. Few inbound international flights, essentially anywhere but Moscow. While privately owned airlines in Russia have yet to be removed from the GDS, all restrictions combined mean that Russia's relative distance to the world has now dramatically increased. Traveling from London to Murmansk, for example, used to be thoroughly simple. A 3-hour Aeroflot flight from Heathrow to Moscow, a 1-hour connection, then a 2-hour flight north to the Arctic city. You see, while many might perceive aircraft as a product, as something sold from manufacturer to airline, increasingly, they're a service. A majority of the world's commercial aircraft fleet is now made up of leased aircraft, those owned by an outside company but rented to airlines for a term of a few years. Rather than getting on a years-long waiting list to spend a huge amount of working capital on a single aircraft, airlines have come to enjoy the flexibility of shorter-term lease agreements. It allows them to grow and shrink their fleets more easily in response to shifts in demand and pay for aircraft as revenue comes in rather than before. Of Russia's 980 passenger aircraft, 777 are leased. Of those, 2/3, or 515, are leased from companies based outside of the country. For example, aircraft often spend much or most of their service lives outside of the country in which they're registered. Therefore, the Cape Town Convention made aircraft leases, and especially aircraft repossessions, enforceable by international law. That's, of course, because Russia is a signatory of the Cape Town Treaty. However, in this case, facing the loss of the majority of its civil aviation fleet, the nation just decided to ignore it. In fact, not only did they ignore it, but instead, Russia began a state-sanctioned theft of billions upon billions of dollars worth of aircraft. However, even that could become difficult. To retain their legal and practical ability to fly, aircraft are continuously subjugated to an extensive maintenance and inspection schedule. But now, both Boeing and Airbus have suspended all maintenance support to Russian airlines, leaving them few options for sourcing legitimate parts. Without legitimate parts, even legitimately owned aircraft could lose the right to fly internationally. And then on top of that, even the Russian-made Sukhoi Superjet. Now, there is precedent for this situation. Iran's aviation industry operated under similarly severe sanctions from 2007 to 2015. It'll have an oversupply due to its airlines' inability to operate most in-demand international routes. However, without the competition, these domestic manufacturers will become one of the only sources for new aircraft. This could also have a spillover effect for China, as their state-owned aircraft manufacturer Comac is nearing first deliveries of its C919 aircraft, roughly equivalent to an A320 or 737. If it's able to make a version free of parts from countries that have sanctioned Russia or China, which is a big if, Comac could capture demand from Russia that could not be fulfilled by Comac's primary competitors, Boeing and Airbus. But the implications go further than that. While the impact of Russia's airspace closure was dulled by weak international travel demand to and from Asia, with most of the continent's borders still closed, in fact, prior to the pandemic, they were the only major European airline which flew the majority of their long-haul routes to Asia rather than North America or elsewhere. But as one airport falls, another rises. Elsewhere, flying. During the Cold War, Anchorage was home to one of the most cosmopolitan airports in the world, as European and Asian airlines used it as a refueling stop, avoiding Soviet airspace. Routing a flight from Tokyo to London via Anchorage does add about 4 hours to flight time, but it is essentially the fastest route when overflying. However, the more fuel you add to an aircraft, the heavier it is, and therefore the more fuel you have to use to carry the added fuel weight. Essentially, as flight distance increases, average fuel burn per mile increases. Unlike passengers, don't care about stops, the closure of Russian airspace has now made that entirely infeasible. Instead, it flies northeast for 6.5 hours towards Anchorage, stops for refueling, then continues 9 hours onward to Amsterdam. Compared to before, normally flying a similar distance between similarly located cities, now flies 11.5 hours first to Dubai, then 7.5 to Paris. 19 hours of flying for a route that previously took less than 12. If these airspace closures prolong, the airline might opt to route the flight through Anchorage, an itinerary that could save them 2 hours over Dubai. FedEx and UPS already have major operations at Anchorage, so it's very possible they'll start to expand the model that's worked for Asia to North America in this new reality. Passenger airlines, however, are likely to take advantage of modern aircraft's incredible range to continue to run flights to Asia nonstop, even if they physically route over Alaska. However, one startup airline is likely quietly celebrating the new inaccessibility of Russian skies. Essentially, they want to become the Iceland Air of the Pacific. This startup does, however, face an uphill battle. Transatlantic fares are some of the highest-priced long-haul flights out there on a per-mile basis, despite strong competition. The market can sustain it since it's connecting one wealthy area to another. Therefore, Northern Pacific Airways is unlikely to be able to offer as strong a cost advantage relative to the market as Iceland Air, our path over flying Anchorage. A passenger originating in Boston flying via Detroit to Seoul on this flight now has a roughly 19-hour itinerary. A flight from Anchorage to London, Amsterdam, or Paris only takes 9 hours. Now, the short of all these compounding implications is that, across the board really, from Western travelers to all strata of Russian society, these changes are going to hurt. The decisions of a few and the world's response to those decisions have ensured we'll all feel the squeeze of closed airspace and aviation sanctions. Beyond the economics, though, February 24th, 2022 marks the end of a period of mostly sustained, mostly stable peace between world powers that allowed for unprecedented efficiency and standardization in the skies and unmatched mobility and convenience for the traveler. The 3 decades of uniquely open and accessible airways are over. When, or more accurately if, we're to return to such a time, at this point, is anyone's guess. If you're anything like me, you typically struggle to decide what to do at dinner time. Should I have unhealthy freezer food, expensive takeout, or a time-consuming home-cooked meal? Of course, I no longer have to make this decision since, for the past 2 years, I've used HelloFresh. That's because it's simultaneously healthy, affordable, and quick. Each week, I select the meals I want on their app, then the next, a box arrives on my doorstep with all the ingredients needed in exactly the right quantities needed. This cuts out all your shopping time and a lot of your prep time so you get straight to the fun part, cooking. For example, I made this delicious buffalo spice chicken in under 30 minutes. Also, HelloFresh is a more sustainable choice. Unlike the grocery store, they offset all their emissions, their packaging is made out of recycled content, and a University of Michigan study found that the pre-portioned ingredients lower food waste by 25% compared to grocery shopping. All around, HelloFresh just makes mealtime better, and that's why I've been using them since long before they sponsored the channel. I recommend you try them out as well, which you can do with an insanely good deal when you click the button on screen or go to HelloFresh.com and use code WENDOVER16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts.